Hello and welcome back for the second session of Morrison Foerster's 2022 Life Sciences MoForum, Growth, Innovation, and Strategy. I'm Matt Carlin and I'm a partner in the firm's Boston office, leading our life sciences transactions and licensing practice. I hope you were able to tune in to yesterday's discussion on the digital transformation in life sciences and the emergence of an explosive growth of digital health technologies across the sector. Today, we are excited to continue our conversation on trends for 2022. With a discussion on the future of drug discovery and diagnostics. We have seen tremendous change over the last few years in the industry, with innovation moving at a rapid rate, much of which is fueled by technology and scientific discovery. However, we are also seeing a significant increase in strategic collaborations between organizations, including among competitors, to rapidly advance next-gen therapies and diagnostics in new and innovative ways. We're also seeing a greater focus on food, nutrition, and diet as significant influencers in drug discovery and diagnostics and in producing more positive outcomes for patients. Our esteemed panel will share their insights into what is driving innovation in their organizations and across the industry over the next year. Before I introduce our speakers, a brief reminder that we hope to see you again tomorrow as we conclude our program with a fireside chat with Shannon Klinger, Chief Legal Officer of Moderna. We look forward to her unique perspective on the industry, the pandemic, and expectations in the industry for 2022 and beyond. My partner, Deanne Maynard, co-chair of our Appellate and Supreme Court practice, will lead that discussion. I also want to quickly go over a few general webinar housekeeping notes. First, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions for our panelists. We will be monitoring this throughout the session, and we will answer them as time allows or follow up after the program. Second, if you experience any technical difficulties, please send us a note in the QA box at the bottom of your screen or email Nora Moore at nmoore@mofo.com. With that, I will briefly introduce our panelists, and I'm super excited to welcome the four of them here today. First, we have Scott Carter, Assistant General Counsel at BeiGene. Scott is a former MoFo, once a MoFo, always a MoFo, right, Scott? And a client, and joined BeiGene in 2019. He focuses on a wide range of IP and technology-based transactions, including licensing, partnering, and technology development. Scott is a graduate of Amherst College, has a PhD in chemistry from Caltech, and received his law degree from UCLA. He is joined by Michelle Egger, the co-founder and CEO of Biomilk. As a passionate food scientist, Michelle looks to combat global food security and malnutrition in everything she does. She has expertise in dairy fermentation, formulation, and processing, and is thrilled to ditch the cows for humans. Inspired by upstream solutions for infant nutrition at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, she became obsessed with advancing human nutrition through better infant feeding options. Michelle seeks to harness the capacity to drive environmental and social change through creative food solutions with a consumer-first design. Her entrepreneurial expertise in social impact and sustainable business models drives her commitment to seek mission-aligned partners. Michelle has an eye to global food systems change. She believes that providing all infants with optimal nutrition in their first 1,000 days of life should be a human right for every parent on the planet. Michelle has a degree in food science from Purdue University and an MBA from Duke University. I'm super excited to hear Michelle and Dr. Lee and all of their experience in food and nutrition on today's panel. Next, we have Daniel Oliver, who is the co-founder and CEO of Rejuvenate Bio, a startup out of George Church's lab at Harvard Medical School, working on reversing aging through the use of novel gene therapies. Prior to Rejuvenate Bio, Daniel was awarded a Blavatnik Fellowship, during which he co-founded Voxel 8. Voxel 8 was named one of the top 9 innovations at CES and one of the top 50 most innovative companies by the MIT Technology Review. Dan is currently an entrepreneur in residence at UC San Diego and was also an entrepreneur in residence at the Wyss Institute. Dan earned a degree in mechanical engineering from Caltech and an MBA from Harvard. And finally, we are joined by Dr. William Lee. He is the president and medical director at the Angiogenesis Foundation and an internationally renowned physician, scientist, and author of the New York Times bestseller, Eat to Beat Disease, The New Science of How Your Body Can Heal Itself. His groundbreaking work has led to the development of more than 30 new medical treatments and impacts care for more than 70 diseases, including cancer, diabetes, blindness, heart disease, and obesity. Under his leadership, the Angiogenesis Foundation has developed a unique social enterprise model based on value-creating collaborations with leading medical academic centers, biopharmaceutical and medical device companies, and government agencies, including the National Institutes of Health, Food and Drug Administration, and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. His TED Talk, Can We Eat to Starve Cancer?, has garnered more than 11 million views. Dr. Lee has appeared on Good Morning America, Live with Kelly and Ryan, CNN, CNBC, Rachel Ray, and the Dr. Oz Show, all of which, of course, pale in comparison to being part of a MoForum. And he has been featured in USA Today, Time Magazine, Atlantic, and O Magazine. He's also been published in Science, the New England Journal of Medicine, The Lancet, Nature Reviews, and other leading peer-reviewed medical journals. So apologies for reading all of that, but I wanted to get it right, and I wanted to make sure that we covered all of the incredible background of the 4 people who are on our panel today. And so with that, why don't we just dive right in? I'm going to direct the first question to Scott and kind of tee us off. I welcome the panelists to talk among themselves, ask questions between themselves. I'm here only to facilitate the conversation in whatever direction you all want to take it. Please, folks who are listening, if you have anything to add, any questions, any comments, we will be monitoring, and we welcome all of your comments and questions during the panel. So Scott, forgive the formality of this question, but just to tee it off, working in a legal and business development role at BeiGene, a company really heading towards becoming a member of the world's elite pharmaceutical companies. Tell us how you source deals to expand the company's research and development and ultimately product pipeline, and what has or will likely change in the future given the COVID pandemic and other market forces.
Thanks, Byron. That's a broad-ranging question. So BeiGene is and has been an oncology-focused company, and we've made a few inroads toward expanding into different indications. We have a large in-house research and development team. So we have homegrown drugs as well as looking at things coming from innovative small companies worldwide. So we source deals primarily by trying to find things, especially on the tool side, that support our research and development efforts, mostly in our China group. And then we also look for product opportunities that fit in with our portfolio. Our focus has been taking molecules from other companies into China, but we've been, as we've grown more successful, looked at trying to find opportunities that give us a more global footprint. So we have our homegrown drugs are now, we have 1 approved drug in the US, and we have others on path to be approved in the US and Europe. But I think, we're always on the lookout for what are the new modalities, new kinds of drugs. So we have a search and evaluation function. We also have our researchers out looking at what's hot, reading papers. So we do everything from talking to researchers at universities through looking at quite established companies. So it runs the gamut.
That's super interesting. And so, and what just explain, if you could, a little bit, just for the audience to better appreciate what is your role? You're in-house, you're a lawyer. What is your role in all of those efforts?
So I sit in the position of supporting all of our business development efforts. We have a pretty significant business development team, roughly 20 people, covering search and evaluation through transaction and execution. And as the in-house lawyer, our role is to shepherd those transactions through from start to finish, from a term sheet all the way through contract execution, sometimes internally and sometimes using external counsel. So we've been executing, between 5 and 10 significant transactions a year, and another probably 10 to 20 more small transactions where we're looking at, a research tool that we might want to have access to or try out. So a material transfer agreement, or a sort of light collaboration where we want to explore new opportunities. And, it's been an incredibly innovative time with new technologies, from AI coming in, CRISPR technologies, new modalities. You'll hear, from Moderna tomorrow, mRNA therapeutics are hot, and a whole bunch of associated technologies. So, there's no shortage of exciting things happening in the world. And, as a company trying to build its portfolio, we're looking at lots of different tools and technologies to bring into the company.
That's great. That's great. Let's turn now to Dan. In some ways, forgive the expression, but in some ways, Rejuvenate Bio is offering a pathway to the fountain of youth and the focus on aging and age-related disease. Tell us a little bit about how Rejuvenate Bio came to be, why the focus on age-related diseases, and how do you anticipate that this focus will impact drug development in the future?
Yeah, so we were founded out of George Church's lab, actually a really good friend of mine from undergrad. So I'm a techer too here, although undergrad, not PhD. Interestingly enough, we were not biologists by training at Caltech, but took pretty disparate paths. My friend was an applied physics major at Caltech, ended up getting a synthetic biology degree at MIT, and was always interested in kind of this idea of being able to reprogram biology. So it's interesting to have a number of these people on the panel. I feel like there's multiple ways of doing that. We're attacking it utilizing genetic interventions, but certainly diet and exercise. Uh-oh, wait one sec here.
No problem. Dan has a 1-year-old at home.
Sorry, the joy of doing Zoom calls at home with
Absolutely.
a 1-year-old. But we are utilizing genetic therapies to do that. And what we started to realize is there had been a huge amount of work done that had shown an ability to increase the health span and lifespan of mice using different genetic interventions. And my co-founder and our chief scientific officer, Noah Davison, along with George Church, came up with the idea of basically packaging them into gene therapies. And gene therapy in this case is really just a transfer mechanism. And so take these, in, if you want to think about a new genetic code, so new program you're uploading to an existing patient. And what we were able to see in mice and now in dogs is that we can treat multiple age-related conditions with these combination-based gene therapies. And then long-term, what we're really interested in doing is trying to change the entire gene expression profile across, not 1 or 2 different genes, but literally thousands. And this starts moving you into like the epigenetic reprogramming realm. And in some case, and I'm really interested in hearing about Biomilk and what to eat correctly, because in some sense, that was really our only tool for a long period of time of being able to manipulate these gene expression profiles. So we're pushing in that area. We're using, in some sense, a more direct tool to do that. But obviously, all of these things should work in concert to kind of push forward. And just one other thing I'll say is the idea with aging. I feel like everybody does like latch onto this idea of a fountain of youth. But what we've seen and what we're really intrigued by is more of this idea of being able to cure and treat multiple age-related conditions, generally raise the health of our patients. So instead of getting a medication or an intervention that has a laundry list of negative side effects, we should be able to prevent other age-related conditions, increase ability to exercise, increase ability to recover, all of these different things. And so I think this moves us into a paradigm attacking, diseases that go across the, full spectrum of our population, almost the flip side of the coin of kind of precision medicine.
Super, super interesting. And just tell us a little bit, Dan, if you could, you shared a little bit on your background, but how did you get involved in this particular lab? Is there any personal story with respect to age-related diseases or anything else from your past that kind of led you to this particular area?
Yeah, I've always been super passionate about translating science. And actually coming out of Caltech, I launched a company, a nonprofit company around creating better wheelchairs for developing countries, and ran that kind of in my spare time, actually, as I was working as an aerospace engineer. Became painfully aware of how little I knew about actually scaling a venture like that and having it make an impact, but also became very aware that like, hey, if you could come up with an idea that makes money, it's a much better way of scaling something and having a lot of impact, positive impact in people's lives. Headed back to Harvard Business School, or I should say headed back to school, got my MBA, was lucky enough to win the Blavatnik Fellowship. I know that's a tough one there, but really with an eye on commercializing science. And to me, the power of that is the more things we can get out of the lab, transfer into companies that make service and products that make a difference in people's lives. It's one of the few things I think is not kind of a, me or you type situation. Is like we can raise the outcomes for everyone. And so I've been super passionate about doing that. Was able to connect with a friend from Caltech. Another good reason to go to Caltech. You have a bunch of smart friends. Basically started hearing what he was doing as his research in George Church's lab as a postdoc. Initially thought what he was doing was completely nuts. But then started seeing the data, and I feel like that's kind of the classic story with all of these. As you start seeing you see interesting data, and it draws you in. And I was able to come in and help them spin the technology out into Rejuvenate.
Great. That's great. Thanks for sharing that. All right, Michelle, tell us a little bit about Biomilk and your journey. We had such a great conversation yesterday, and I was fascinated by it. And really, and I know this is a bit of a loaded question, but what do you anticipate the impact of what Biomilk is doing? What's the outcome you're looking for, and what's the greater impact that this will all have on women's health and children's health?
Yeah. But before I answer your question directly, I just want to highlight what Dan just said.
Yeah,
the hardest part around, in my opinion, impact business models is aligning impact into dollar out, or dollar into impact out. We always want to try to create companies that have this huge outsized impact, but if there's not a sustainable business model in terms of truly that the business can sustain, not just talking about climate change the way we use sustainability today, it's not worth it to go that endeavor. So I had a similar experience to Dan, it sounds like, where I tried to start a group that was a social enterprise, really focused much more on food insecurity, and realized there's not a foundational business model in our capitalistic society that helps drive this impact. It's not going to sustain itself. And I didn't really want to build something that wasn't scalable or wasn't sustainable to be able to have the impact I know the world needs. And so infant nutrition is something I fell into. Unlike Dan, I do not have any little ones in the background here. And my passion for Biomilk and the work we do is really born out of the belief that human nutrition and the first 1,000 days of life of development set the course immunologically, musculoskeletally, and cognitively that many of us experience our health outcomes and lifestyle for the rest of our lives. And when you think about that, we use the same powdered bovine formula and minerals that we invented in about 1940 to feed a majority of our children here in the US globally, because exclusive breastfeeding is frankly really challenging because of the circumstances for most families to not use any formula. It's pretty tragic. We found ways to innovate so many other parts of our lives, but we haven't really applied biotechnology or other more advanced biology to the space of nutrition. And infants have such an outsized impact in the moment of time where that nutritional intervention happens that we can really change the course of lives. And so my intro talks a lot about that I'm a food scientist, but frankly, we're a mammary biotechnology company. We're using human mammary cells in 3D construct to basically create vivo tissue outside of the body and produce human milk outside of the body. And the idea for that innovation really came from Layla, my CSO, who's a mother herself, a PhD cell biologist, who realized, milk production is inherently a cellular process dictated by biophysical environment and stimuli, right? And that we could get better infant nutrition to more infants when exclusive breastfeeding or constant breast milk with a birthing parent isn't possible. We could give parents more options to not feel the shame and guilt and stigma of using formula when exclusive breastfeeding fails, which we know is a huge problem for women, but even increasingly broadly for parents, I think, experiencing the challenges of feeding. And lastly, we can cut more bovine-based formula out of the system and reduce the amount of cow's milk needed for a powdered product that nutritionally is inferior to human milk, because human cells evolutionarily have been designed to produce the components of human benefit that we use for prebiotics in the gut, we use for that musculoskeletal growth, and we use to advance earlier cognition. So it's lofty goals, but we look to bring a human milk product direct to consumer in the next 4 years so that we can enable more parents to have better feeding options for their families and hopefully nourish healthier babies.
That's incredible, and I'm sure that you and Dr. Lee will hopefully after this connect and have a lot to talk about. Certainly a lot of overlap there. So with all of that and everything you've heard, Dr. Lee, there's been so much focus on drug development in recent years. Particularly during the last couple of years with the pandemic. One of the things that we were talking about recently was how certain companies and certain drugs and vaccines, and Scott, you mentioned the prevalence of mRNA vaccines and science and whatnot, how those have all become, in light of the pandemic, really household names, things that a lot of people probably didn't know about a couple of years ago, they've learned quite a bit about in light of the pandemic. And certainly this whole concept of citizen scientists is having a direct impact, I think, on drug development and diagnostic development. But Dr. Lee, as you kind of think about all of this, how do we interject the role of food into this whole process, from the process of drug development, diagnostic development, to the process of the ability of the drugs to actually do what they're supposed to do and have positive outcomes for patients? What's the role of food? Tell us a little bit, if you could, about how you got into all of this, and kind of what your vision for the future interaction between drugs and food could be in the coming years.
Yeah, well, it was a real pleasure for me to actually be invited to participate in this panel. My background actually is in drug development and therapeutic development. I've been doing that for almost 30 years. My background actually was in vascular biology and looking at common denominators for addressing both health and disease, with this idea of being able to look at diseases with insufficient circulation, insufficient angiogenesis, and on the other side, where there are diseases, a number of diseases that are characterized by excessive abnormal blood vessel growth. And really what prompted me into that area, which set the stage for my work in food as medicine, was really looking for common denominators. The idea that you can actually leverage common processes that are inherent to controlling homeostasis or pathology sort of gave a point of leverage, so you could have a scalable impact by pulling the bow back of and sending a single arrow using that common denominator approach through multiple conditions at once. And so I started out really in biopharmaceuticals, looking at angiogenesis-based therapeutics that way. I trained in Judith Volkmann's lab at Harvard, and this was going way back in the mid-1980s, and was so inspired by what I saw. I realized that having a nonprofit, a scientific nonprofit that could actually create a social enterprise model to push common denominator principles through therapeutic development, through industry, through investment, through regulation, and then ultimately through to the professional environment and consumers, was actually an unmet need and an opportunity to be able to drive forward. So I've actually been involved with 41 and very shortly 42, we anticipate FDA-approved drugs for oncology, vision loss, and complications of diabetes. And it was really out of that success as a model, I started to realize that these processes that we were targeting for therapy, very specifically by looking at genes and cytokines and cell pathways through antibodies, small molecules, or other approaches, honestly, we were looking at triggering targets or hitting targets that would actually essentially ablate disease or modify disease. But if you look at the control set of people that we enrolled in almost all these clinical trials, these are the people for whom those pathways are actually functionally normally. And so what I started to realize is that while we focus on kind of like the treatment groups, there was a lot to be learned from the control groups and understanding how the body normally functions. Another way to think about this is that so much of our effort in life sciences is to ask what causes a disease and how can we address that using the efficient use of technology, scalable use of technology. I sort of turned that argument or that question around in my head about 15 years ago and asked a different question. And that question is, why don't we get disease more often? So if you think about it, that's really, that's potentially more profound to understand how it is physiologically we're able to repel the damage that ultraviolet radiation impacts on our skin or fumes from off-gassing on a carpet actually would damage our lungs, or radon from beneath our feet would actually damage us. Like, why is it that we can be exposed to all these things throughout our lifetime and actually be resilient? And so that resilience of health is something that I became fascinated by. And the way that I came at this, after lots of successful drug development efforts, was to say, can we turn the clock back against disease and look at earlier stages of pre-disease or pre-intervention? And could we actually use the same tools of life sciences to be able to look at preemptive interventions? And so, Michelle, you're talking about mammary products. Daniel, your company is looking at cell and signal pathways that actually can intercept the diseases of aging. And Scott, I know that among many things that BeiGene does, you're looking at cancer immunotherapy. Well, look, all these things kind of boil back. It's kind of like boiling away the Pacific Ocean to see how everything's interconnected to how our body is hardwired. We have health defense systems that were formed along with our other organs in utero. And when we actually, hit planet Earth on day one of our life, these health defense systems are firing on all cylinders until our last breath. And along the way, environmental forces are assaulting our defenses. And either we can do something to take down our defenses or we can build them back up. And that's really what life sciences and biopharmaceuticals is largely trying to do. So diet is an opportunity to be able to study this entire kind of network pharmacology with an F as opposed to a PH, in a completely different way, which is, how do the foods that we eat? And we know some healthy patterns, mostly whole plant-based foods, healthy oils, fats, legumes, seeds, seafood, those kinds of things that are, anybody can, people wear t-shirts talking about what the healthy foods are. What my interest in is in doing a deep dive to understand how these foods alone and in combination trigger pathways that can actually maintain health. Now, how does that actually impact drug development? Number one, well, one thing we've done is at the National Cancer Institute, for example, we set up screening systems for cancer drugs. And we would do sort of, I would say, medium throughput screening of different interesting compounds. And one of the things that I did is actually disguise a bunch of food extracts and give them fancy, monikers that look like drug names and throw them into the system to see what would happen. And what was really quite amazing is that in those systems, head to head, many food compounds actually held their own, and in some cases were more potent than the drug and moieties themselves. And that really opened a gateway for me to sort of think about, how would we actually put together a platform of studying food as medicine? You have to do molecular, cellular, in vitro, in vivo. You can do small human studies. And then the advantage of food as medicine research is we can do epidemiological studies. Now at the FDA, they call that real world data. Well, we have real world data on food all around us. And so one of the things that I'm, and as an example of how, so what I'm thinking is that there is this convergence where the methodology of studying drugs can be applied to food. At the same time, the impact of food can be applied to studying the methodology and to improve drug development. Let me tell you in the latter why that matters. A few weeks ago in the journal Science, a landmark paper came out looking at the impact of dietary factors on cancer immunotherapy for checkpoint inhibitors, which many groups are actually now developing, specifically for metastatic melanoma. They actually found that one bacteria, which is called Ruminococcus, impacted on survivors or responders to immunotherapy compared to people who are non-responders. And that's a big deal when you're looking at value-based care, which is what payers are ultimately going to be doing. By way of disclosure, I have a federal appointment at CMS. And so one of the things that we always look at is, what's the value proposition? How are we making the case? So this one bacteria makes a difference between a responder or a non-responder in immunotherapy in this study. What makes the difference between the one bacteria? It turned out to be dietary fiber intake. Now, they actually figured out that people who were eating dietary fiber had more of this Ruminococcus bacteria, which then resulted in activity in that, and they could calculate it quantitatively. What was the impact of the dietary fiber, how much you need? And so in this paper in Science, they said they calculated 5 grams of dietary fiber per day was associated with stimulating this bacteria, which was associated with a response. Hypothesis generating at best, but think about the impact of developing the next generation of checkpoint inhibitors. Now, how much did you need to actually do this? Readily achievable amounts of dietary fiber. Exactly 5 grams of dietary fiber lowered mortality by 30%. How much is 5 grams of dietary fiber? In the amount of an average size pear. All right. So how many people are we enrolling in clinical trials where we are not adequately thinking about, if not controlling, dietary impact? I think that is really one of the frames that can be brought into the picture for therapeutic development going forward.
And I hate to ask this. Thank you for that. And Michelle, I'm going to turn to you next to kind of get your thoughts on all of that, given Biomilk's role in that ecosystem. But I guess it just kind of begs the question: how do we? Are there any immediate things that can be done to enhance the role of food in every, the development efforts that you just described? Is there? I know the answer, but what work is being done to ensure that food does play a role so that we can affect more positive outcomes and have the interaction between food and drug development like you described?
Yeah, I think, well, I just want to highlight that the reason I found this work so engaging, even as a food scientist, as we were getting Biomilk going, was just there are specific points of leverage or opportunity that we know have an outsized impact. So it's not as though all food needs to go through an innovation process where suddenly we think of it as medicine. You want to eat a bag of Cheetos with your lunch, you can still do that. It's not going to kill you. It's life, it's moderation, right? And I think if you talk to any dietitian or—
I'm not sure that that's in the book Eat to Beat Disease.
It's probably not, but I think we have to be realists, right? Like, we're not going to innovate every part of the food system to suddenly act like a drug. But there are specific moments in development or specific risk factors that we can really control for. And that's why infant nutrition was so intriguing to me. The broader field of cellular agriculture, utilizing fermentation and cell culture technology to produce meat outside of the animal or milk outside of the human, is an emerging field across many spaces. But something like infant nutrition as a target has an outsized benefit on human health versus just maybe a sustainability or climate change benefit. And so it's not to say one's more important than the other, but I really think we can look particularly at what outcome we're trying to achieve and how nature does it better, and how we then do that biomimicry appropriately through cell culture. And so the example I would give, this technology that we're utilizing looks like monoclonal antibody production, more or less, in a lot of ways, which to most people on this call probably have a more intimate understanding of that production than the average American, right? Or person in the world. And we're essentially utilizing monoclonal antibody production with downstream processing that looks more like dairy processing, which is the world I came from, and a fundamental understanding of a cell type and biological process that we hadn't previously investigated other than cancer research. We only ever looked at mammary cells to see when they grew wrong, not how they grew in healthy natural phenotype. And so the pairing of these kind of 3 areas that we knew something about, but came to this really innovative solution, came about by just thinking about a problem differently, asking the question, like, could we do this better? And why is it important that we do? And so we get the question all the time from investors, including we had our last Series A round was led by MoFo Holdings. And their core question was, why has someone else not done this before?
Yeah,
what you're doing fundamentally, right? Scientifically, it's really hard.
Right.
Science team, if you're watching it, it's not as easy as it sounds, but it's not like we're building rockets. There are many ways that this is fundamentally understood. And the difference is that we hadn't put together the pieces to apply to a new problem that wasn't a pharmacological problem. It wasn't something we talked about. We diagnose women as low milk supply with no additional understanding of why they can't produce breast milk fundamentally in their own bodies. And so the field of lactation science and the exposure there just took a really smart woman experiencing a problem in her own life and asking, why haven't we found a way to solve this? And so I think as we look at the food system, we'll see more and more opportunities here where we say, why haven't we found a way to solve this? Or like, wouldn't it be nice if this were different? And previously we've relied on really kind of ham-fisted methods of trying to innovate food. And I think we're going to see precision biology, we're going to see biotechnology, we're going to see this space continue to find food targets that will move forward for better health outcomes with that outcome in mind, not just a general scatter shot of trying to make things better. So I'm very hopeful that there's a lot of innovation to come. And I would encourage you, if you're a brilliant pharma mind, to take a step back and say, what other problems can we solve for that I might have technological understanding that, because of the cost curves of pharma development or because of the equipment I use, I would never have considered making it this way, that we may be able to advance the entire field with.
Scott, I want to bring you into the conversation a bit here as the representative of, dare I say, big pharma, almost big pharma. What are your thoughts on what Michelle and Dr. Lee are saying, and have you experienced this at all?
So I think Dr. Lee hit on a point that's absolutely critical to all drug development, which is the sad reality that for us, our best drugs work in a very small set of patients. So if a checkpoint inhibitor works for a cancer patient, it's an amazing outcome. The sad reality for us is that positive outcome happens in only 25 to 35% of patients. So we, like all pharma companies, are very, very interested in trying to give medicines to the population that will benefit most. And so we incorporate genetic screening, which, trying to pre-screen the patients and look for diagnostics and things that will help us, find the target population that responds. So we're not giving expensive drugs to people who aren't going to respond. Food adds that extra element and, complexities in healthcare. And I'm reminded of a former client years ago that ran a study in, I think it was the Czech Republic, but they basically found that everyone in their study did really well. So they couldn't detect a difference in their drug working. And the reality was, when they ran their clinical study, they ended up giving much better medical care in general to the entire study population, both the placebo group and the treated group. And it turned out that just providing base level medical care, maybe nutrition access or other things, just improved the health of everyone in the study and made it harder to differentiate. So I think we're very, very interested in techniques to do it. One, to improve, the efficacy of our drug. The second is to improve cost, and we are highly sensitive to cost because our major commercial market has been China, and we're operating in a regime where the Chinese government sets prices for most pharmaceuticals. So we can't even operate in some of the sort of newest, fanciest areas of technology for therapeutics because they're just too expensive. We don't have any CAR T products, and we're not likely to go that direction. So finding ways to find the right people and treat them the best possible way is important. I think from our perspective, the fundamental challenge of food-based intervention is, that it's hard for people to monetize, and the business side is looking for ways to make money, and giving people a pair is, it's hard to sell expensive pairs. But we are very well aligned in saying, well, let's try to find the best way to get our drugs to work the best possible way. And if it meant, the protocol included a pair a day for patients, I think we'd be ecstatic to do that. So I think Dr. Lee's got a question or comment there.
Oh, I was just going to build on what you're saying, which is, the idea is that food is not only an intervention, but it actually is a process to think about optimizing what we're already doing. So in the case of the dietary fiber insight, you can sort of go in diagnostics with the microbiome, which then might help to pick out patients. But rather than leave opportunities on the ground, perhaps there could be an adjuvant added to an immunotherapy that's based on the biology of dietary fiber. And so, one of the things that I think needs to happen is really a convergence of the worlds, of different industrial worlds, and not to make it so separate where you need to actually have a therapeutic pair. That may be one option, but I think much more powerfully, we can think about, well, what is it that ruminococcus is doing? What pathway is it activating? And then the dietary fiber, how is it actually enhancing the microbiome, and perhaps that the bacteria is not the only thing it's actually doing. Maybe it's a short chain fatty acids. So then can we go upstream and think about an intervention that might involve that? And so, as somebody who comes from their drug development, I'm totally, I think, I'm able to actually be a sort of a polyglot in terms of thinking about what's the right way to actually put the right pieces together in the right sandbox. And I think that there's sort of the food side, which I think Michelle has been working on as a solution, and certainly a drug side. The biology is the same. To me, that's the beauty.
I want to highlight though, and I'd be interested in Dan's perspective and Scott's as well, of when you try to combine these two, that same biology, but two disparate cost worlds. So you're talking food and pharma, or you're talking, maybe a health intervention that's more at a consumer level versus a payer level, right? You have a massive disconnect in how you create innovation for those two spaces, because the cost that you're going to be able to be reimbursed or sell at is very different. And so one of the challenges we experience as a smaller biotech firm, and I'm not sure if it's similar for Dan, is, the cost basis of equipment, of expertise, of lab space, with the outcome still being a 4 or 5 year path the way a drug might, because there's so much fundamental biology understanding to do. But we can't charge $10,000 an ounce for this product because it's not a monoclonal antibody, makes for these kind of mismatch of business models. So I wonder how you incorporate this lens that it's all the same biology in the realities of the market dynamics that exist, where we have kind of this bloated healthcare system that does a great job of spurring innovation at a huge level, but doesn't necessarily support these innovations that take a long time and are very intersectional.
Yeah, I mean, I think the answer long-term is like the way we regulate pharmaceuticals and health need to come together. And we need to start thinking about our healthcare system is making people healthier versus them being cars that break down and you need to replace the transmission at like 40,000 miles or something. That would be a bad car. But you see my point. Near term, I think the key is interesting business models that bring these things to market. So Scott, you're talking about, having to access a pharmaceutical market that has a pretty different pricing structure. I mean, we're trying to bring our gene therapies initially into the animal health market. And so, similar challenges there. And we're using, Michelle, like checking out your website, your bioreactors, the bioreactors you use are not totally dissimilar to how AAV or the type of virus we're made is made. And so the thing I've seen there is, for typical gene therapy companies, at least, the focus on costs or COGS of your product have like not been there, because who cares if you're charging $1 million or $2 million for it? But what we're starting to see, and I think these things kind of can start overlapping in multiple areas, as people want to take these technologies into ever increasing larger patient populations, maybe cost isn't the thing that's driving it, but certainly yields and how many treatments they can get out from a manufacturing process do start becoming a big deal. So we have efforts internally to drastically increase yields. There are multiple companies that have been started to basically do process improvements across a number of different things in cell and gene therapy manufacturing. All of those things are going to yield higher yields, but also hopefully, drive down costs. You're being able to access more and more different, solutions for different problems across the board. But, to me, this idea that we're going to continue to develop therapies that target very, very specific diseases and have almost no context to that, besides that they didn't have any adverse events in a phase 1 trial, is I think short-sighted. And you're starting to see problems with this, across a number of, approvals here for different, I won't reference, but there's huge outcry for certain approvals that in context of our healthcare system make absolutely no sense, right? And so, how is that going to continue to go on?
I can add, and I not to focus solely on cost, but one of the things we've done as a company is we made our own manufacturing facility in China, and we just recently bought a piece of land in New Jersey and are on the path to constructing our own. place to make things and have control, have a little bit more control of cost. But one of the things we do is partner with a lot of innovators who help us, with all facets of that manufacturing process. And one little company we work with gave us, optimized media to grow the cells that we're using, and that can double the yield. And that doubling of yield is, if in a cost-conscious world is incredibly important to us. So I think what you say resonates for us. We want to push a project to a point where we can make money. We're not a nonprofit, but we sometimes take projects on that are borderline for China, and what may be the cost of goods in the US or Europe that's viable will not fly in China. So I think most companies need to have a balance of where they're doing business, precisely to just drive down COGS. So for us, that's part of our initial diligence, which is unlike a lot of global pharmaceutical companies where we actually want to see low cost. But largely, I think we are driven by diseases that have unmet needs, where patients, there aren't good solutions. There are still many cancers. Our primary focus where we don't have good treatments. So we have things we are pursuing precisely because of the science, but with an overlay of we want to be able to do it commercially at the end of the day.
And just one more thing I'll say is, like, I think this focus on precision medicine is, interesting in utilizing technology in novel areas, but it also leaves us with this issue that you often are trying to sell your product to a limited market because you've basically sculpted it down to this very, very small patient population. And because the regulatory framework has been set up such that you can get through clinical trials quicker there, it's incentivized people to get there. And then we don't have a feedback loop with basically our payers on, hey, you're trying to amortize your trial cost across a patient population that maybe is a couple dozen. And so I also think, one of the answers here is also, and this is, I think, encouraging, is a focus on disease categories with larger patient populations also helps solve these issues, because it's really not just a COGS issue on manufacturing. Oftentimes these treatments you're seeing, it's an amortization of like trial costs and all development across this, and then you're trying to get that back from less than 100 patients. Think if that drug or that therapy or that intervention instead had been focused on a patient population that was 10 million, what would they be charging? What would their price point be? So, I think it's important too. We get this a lot being a gene therapy company because the price points, and I want to be clear on that, the price points are in the millions. But the COGS, if you go look at the underlying COGS, even with the unoptimized manufacturing processes, are typically less than 10% of that. So, what is the real issue? It's not, the COGS part I think we need to push on, but also this idea of amortizing it across a large patient base. And so, that's why we're excited to go push into these areas.
Other comments, Dr. Lee? Any hearing everything that you just heard, thoughts?
Well, one of the just to build on what Dan was saying, and to reflect on the complexity that Michelle and Scott were bringing up, is the fact that when we actually study the molecular nutrition and nutritional impact of food, what we usually discover, without having to go too deep, is this idea of systems biology effects. And so while precision medicine is elegant in its presentation, I mean, the best pitch decks are describing, sort of this linear targeting that actually can occur with some positive outcomes. The reality is that food teaches us that combinatorial effects in an organism that actually has multiplicity of effects actually can generate outcomes that are ultimately much more beneficial than you can actually measure with single approvable endpoints. And I think that that's another kind of dimension to think about, is, or maybe a rethink about, is how do we account for systems biology, the complexity of the organism? How do we then convert that complexity into measurable endpoints that we can actually then deliver as value to, whether it's payers and patients and providers? And then how do we actually articulate that, frankly, to consumers, which ultimately is that back to the investor to understand that, look, part of the part of the incredible value of being very precise is that we can actually define things really well. Once you get something in the human body, things become remarkably imprecise, at least at the level of measurement we have now. So can we actually also expand our endpoints and our actually measurements to capture greater value? Because the systems biology approach in the body, I mean, look, that's what physiology is going to do no matter what. And I think to some extent, we are still stuck with, decades old, slowly evolving frameworks for endpoint measurements for approvable interventions.
So that's all really fascinating, everybody. So we have about 8 minutes left in our session here, and of course I didn't get to any of the questions I wanted to ask, but that usually happens. So I wanted to ask and leave the audience with your thoughts on the future and the challenges, Dan and Michelle, from a startup perspective. You touched on that a little bit already. Scott, from an international, global, big pharma, or on the cusp of becoming, part of that elite group, the challenges you're facing. And then Dr. Lee, where do we go from here? How can we, and you touched on this already, but leaving the session today, how can we as a community, either in food or in drug development or wherever you might be, how can we work together as an ecosystem in order to improve what we're doing today so we have better outcomes tomorrow? I didn't write any of that down. I just sort of came up with it. I apologize. But why don't we go around the circle here? And why don't I start with Michelle, if that's okay? And if you want to pass and think, that's okay too.
No, I think it's fine. As a trained food scientist, dairy scientist, I never expected to be a CEO of a fast-growing VC-backed biotech startup. This is not the world I intended to be in. Under a decade ago, I was making 80,000-gallon batches of yogurt, right? So I really encourage us to think about where our natural inclinations and passions align to, and worry less about what we're trained in sectorally, and more about how we bring our experience and passion to bear. And I think the fact that we founded Biomilk out of the belief that better nutrition can impact human health at a level that you might see a drug or something else really focused in a targeted way, has allowed us to innovate entirely differently than if we were trying to go after this as making one or two human components recombinantly with yeast cells, which is what infant formula companies have been trying to do for decades, right? So I really think inspiring other people to use the skills they have today to look for opportunity areas where they might be able to impact change, and worrying a little bit less about which accreditations, which fancy schools, how many letters are after our names, and instead find teams that can align around that passion and ability is much more important. And I'm really proud of cellular agriculture as a space and synthetic biology more broadly, with how much of that is happening, and encourage more people to dive in, find areas that they would never have considered joining. We need you.
That's such a good message. And it seems like perhaps a small silver lining of the pandemic is that so many people are doing that now, or it seems like, perhaps better said, there's an increase in people doing that now, and focusing on the future and not so much kind of the antiquated things that we focused on in the past. And so that's a really great message. Dan, along the same lines, startup company, you touched on this already. How do you get from here to there, and what does the future hold, and what can we do better to get you from here to there?
Well, I think we need more people like Michelle, who are like, these kind of passionate founders that come in and bring like creativity and a different mindset to how we build these types of companies. I view my co-founder Noah as that as well. And
you're probably some of that too, right?
Oh no, I'm just a Harvard MBA. Yeah, I'm one of those dumb people with all the letters. But the other thing I think what that brings is you end up with like different business models pushing in different areas that like start pushing the limits. But I do think that takes with those people coming in, it takes also an investment community and an acquisition community that are open to new ideas and are open, are still, taking rigorous diligence processes, particularly around the data generated here, but also have an openness to, why the rules of thumb were what they were and what can change now that we're moving into like a new, more biologic driven modality or whatever it is. And so I think we often see that with gene therapy. It's like, why hasn't someone used gene therapy for this? It's like, well, almost all the drug development or therapeutic development has been small molecule drug development for literally, a century. And a lot of the ways people have been taught to do that and the rules that work quite well for that don't apply for some of the things that are coming out now. So a willingness to question the underlying assumptions of how some things are done, and also an openness to looking at new ideas and being willing to change. And we certainly see that out there, but I think the more of that, the more interesting, novel approaches you're going to have coming through.
Scott, 1 minute or less. The clock's a ticking here.
Yeah. So two quick things. So one is I think it's a super exciting time in the industry because the number of new tools, and we're technology agnostic compared to a startup focused on one technology. There's just amazing things happening. So all these things coming to bear, and some things that have been around for 20 years are now coming to fruition, new approaches to making therapeutics. So mRNA therapeutics is one. Protein degradation, it was something that I worked on 20 years ago, and it seemed kind of like a pipe dream, and it's real now. And we have cell therapies, we have people going after all sorts of things. So I think that's just really an exciting time. So we're increasing the speed to make therapeutics. We're increasing the diagnostic possibilities, the ability to target things. So I've gone through some ups and downs in the field where I've been more or less excited, and immunotherapy for cancer has just been an exciting area, where things had stagnated. So, I'm excited on all fronts, from research and development through to, our commercialization efforts, but the clinical development tools are also improving as well. So, that's I'm an optimist at the moment, which is good.
Dr. Lee, leave us with the hopeful message. How does this all come together for the future?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things we've talked about today that's important is to keep asking questions. Food is so intimate, we can all relate to it, and we can think about how food might impact a technology that we're all trying to develop. And then I would say seek the data, because some data might already exist. And if you don't have the data, look for it, or maybe generate the data to ask if there's some dietary impact on the technologies that are developing that might impact trial design or preclinical design. I think find collaborators. This world moves forward, everything moves faster and better with collaboration. And there are people that work in the food and medicine and nutrition space that are not classically in the life science space. I think we need to bring those worlds together. And then finally, what I would say is that what the past 20 years has told us is that it's important to dare to change the industry model. So whatever like the people we have on this panel right here are all industry model changers. We have to not be afraid to actually reinvent the systems in which we're actually all working. And what I would sort of offer is that the impact of what is in food and how the body responds to it is a very important new part of the equation for life science product development.
Couldn't agree more. You all are, I'm just blown away, honestly. I encourage everyone who attended to link in with Scott and Daniel and Michelle and Dr. Lee. Connect with them. I'm sure they're going to be mad at me for saying this, but connect with them and get more information and be part of this discussion and this community. By all means, go out and buy Dr. Lee's book. It really is incredible. I'm a bit obsessed with it. Listen to the masterclass, which we will be pushing out as well through mofo.com. And by all means, thank you, the four of you. This was such an incredible discussion. Really, really, really exciting and informative, and I just loved it. Thanks to the audience for participating. We certainly hope you found this discussion valuable. Really looking forward to welcoming you back for our discussion tomorrow with Shannon Klinger. I hope you can all attend, ask lots of questions, and like Dr. Lee said, just be part of the discussion, be part of the disruption, and let's just continue doing what we're doing. So thank you all. I appreciate it so much, and we can close it there.